Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Defining Next Generation Privileged Identity Management. We have two presenters today, Patrick McBride, our VP of Marketing here at Xceedium, and John Suit, our VP of Product Management here at Xceedium. We will be holding some time towards the end to answer any of your questions, so as we go along, please feel free to type your questions into the questions box and we will make sure we get to them. We are also recording this webinar, so everyone will be receiving a copy of the recording within the next day or so. I hope you all enjoy our presentation today, and with that, I'll hand it over to Patrick. So whenever you are ready, Patrick, you're all set to begin.
Thanks, David, and welcome everybody. We're delighted to have you on board today. We've got an audience kind of strewn across a lot of time zones, which is fairly fairly consistent for us. Actually, we do a lot of international business, so it's always fun to see our colleagues from across the Pacific and the Atlantic joining in. I have one correction. Unfortunately, John Suit got called away this afternoon on he assures me a very, very important technical call he's got to be on that is not golf related at all. But the good news is this is part one in a series that we're going to do today. We'll go through the agenda in just a second, but John's going to join us again next week where we're going to dive into some of the more technical aspects of next generation privileged identity management, show some use cases, some architectural diagrams, and really show how that actually works. And then we'll follow that up. So that's on the 23rd. So keep an eye out for the invite for that. It'll be the part two of the three-part series. And then on the 30th, we're going to follow that up where we're going to dig in to some really cool new stuff that we've done with our Xsuite product for Amazon Web Services and some unique capability that we're rolling out there. And we'll do more of the same in that scenario. We'll introduce some of that capability, but do a much deeper dive of technical architecture and demo. So the idea is for this webinar to really set up the overall idea of next generation. What does it take? What are some of the requirements? What's changed in the environment that makes this important at this point? And then use the next two webinars in the series to really take a much deeper dive. So welcome to the first part, and we'll start up. So without further ado, we're going to cover really three aspects of this idea of next generation. First of all, we're going to do a fairly deep dive and explore what's really driving that. And a couple things are coming together these days. That is, to some extent, the whole idea of a privileged identity management tool set has really matured over the last couple of years. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that and what kind of went into it, a little bit of the history of how these components came together and why they need to be in place. We'll talk a little bit about the drivers for privileged identity management in general, and then much more specifically about what's driving some of the next-gen requirements for vendors like us. We'll dive, at some level of depth into the key requirements. What are the top, set of requirements to meet if you're actually going to meet some of the new challenges today and actually be next gen. And then we'll introduce our Xsuite platform. We're not going to spend a whole lot of that time on that today. We'll give you a bit of an overview there, and then, like we said, we'll really drive into a lot more detail and demos over the next two webinars. So with that, let's start out, first of all, discussing, why is there actually even a need for privileged identity management? So we won't do the, in the beginning, pitch, but we'll do something a little bit close to that. And, the good news in bad news as of late is we've actually got a new poster child for why. Anybody who's been in security has probably been following the Snowden case a little bit. We're not here to make any kind of political commentary on the case itself, but clearly Snowden, as a systems administrator, was able to get to things that he should not have been able to get to, and in some ways, if you go back a couple of years, WikiLeaks was a little bit of a clarion call for insider threat, but it really wasn't quite as much about privilege insider. He was a general end user who was overprivileged or at least not monitored well, and there's lots of other things that protections that could have been in place, stopping the use of USBs or downloading onto DVDs and things like that. But that wasn't necessarily, he didn't have the same kind of privileges that somebody like Snowden did in the network. So for better or for worse, Snowden will become kind of the poster child for why you need this stuff. It's always a good test for me when I can, talk, when I can tell my parents, what we do by, naming, a thing or a person or an event. That usually makes it a little bit more simplified. And that is exactly the case here. We don't, at Xceedium, have any additional insights above what's been reported in terms of how he got access or anything like that. So I'm not trying to make a commentary on, whether our product or any other product in the space would have solved the whole problem or not. But certainly this was one of those cases where a truly privileged insider got to things that they weren't specifically supposed to get to. And so we've got that scenario. Now, the interesting thing about it, I thought, and another point to make was the response out of NSA. And this was widely publicized, but General Alexander had made some comments about implementing the two-man rule, for systems and network administrators. I had the privilege last week of speaking at the Cloud Identity Summit in Napa. So that was nice on two ends. It was a great gathering of the Identirati in Napa, to discuss lots of deep topics there, and it was in wine country, so that wasn't too bad either. But had a lot of discussion on this with different people. This idea of the two-man rule. So two things came up. One was how practical was it in an enterprise outside of NSA, which we'll talk about for a second. The other one was, wait a minute, we know a lot of really talented young ladies and women who work at NSA, CIA, and other places. So maybe it could be the two-woman rule as well. So there was some feedback from some of the colleagues that I talked to about it being a sexist comment. But taking that out of the play for a moment, certainly the idea of the two-man rule is that anything anybody would do would have some sort of an escort, and this is exactly how the NSA operates for people who go to Fort Meade and visit NSA facility. They're escorted around the building if they have to go into places where there's more classified, higher levels of classification. People clear their desks and things like that. So they take a great deal of care on a physical presence. And General Alexander made the comment about extending that to a similar scenario for systems administrators, network administrators, etc. Now, I don't know about you, but the NSA's got a fair amount of funding, but that is maybe practical and maybe even warranted in some cases. But most enterprises aren't going to double up on the number of systems or network administrators they have, and this isn't something you can let off to a secretary or somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. Somebody watching somebody execute some Perl scripts on a Unix box. Needs a little bit of technical acumen to understand what the person that they're following around may be doing. So it's not as simple as just having a warm body there. It would be having a warm body that would actually also know what's going on. So clearly this might work in for some organizations in some cases, but it is not a broad prescription for how you deal with this problem in general. It has to go beyond that. So let's talk a little bit about, so this, what the point that we want to make with this slide is that this idea of insider risk, insider threat, privileged insiders being risky administrators, etc., is not new. This is something that has been covered, pretty much every year. For example, that the data breach, the Verizon data breach investigation report has been out. And we've seen, this is pulled, some of the comments here in the bullet points are pulled, directly from the report. What were some of the key things that happened, and what were some of the key recommendations to mitigate those things. And the common thread here, kind of outlined in red, is administrative and privilege activity, restricting administrative rights and monitoring those things, et cetera. So. And I think everybody's pretty familiar. If you're not familiar with the Verizon data breach report, it's a fantastic thing to read through, because what we're looking at that is not and when we look at that report, you're not looking at theory. This is the team at Verizon and a huge number of partners across law enforcement and government globally. This isn't just a U.S.-based effort, who have gone through lots of different data breaches and taken a much more detailed look at who, why, when, well, basically dissecting those breaches, understanding the motivations, understanding who actually did what they did, how they did it, and then drawing some conclusions about what you could do to prevent that. And the thing that makes it really nice is since it's actual data breaches, we're not talking theory anymore about what you should be doing. Notice one interesting thing in the report this year. And what this chart is, it's a little bit of an eye chart, so let me explain it. Along the left-hand side, you've got basically the threat actions. These are the ways that, as the breaches were dissected and they took a deep look at how these things happen. These were some of the ways in which the threat actions that caused those breaches. And what it's mapped against is the SANS top 20 controls. And if you do a SANS top 20 Google search, you'll be able to pull up the control set. And so across the top is each of the controls, and wherever there's a dot, that represents where that control could mitigate or stop that thing from happening. Now, the interesting thing to note here is most data breaches weren't, there's multiple different things that happened. There was a chain of events that ended up happening to cause the actual breach. It wasn't a one thing and one thing only. It may be a combination of a phishing attack, for example, that grabbed, stole credentials that were then used later, to do the breach. So the idea is wherever there's a dot, that control could have helped mitigate or stop or break one of those links in the chain, which could have stopped the whole thing. And the interesting thing here is the thing that has the most dots in it is this idea of controlling the use of administrative privileges, which is the 12th critical control in the top 20 list. So I'd encourage you all to take a look at the top 20 list in general, because I think it's a really nice layout of some of the things that is grounded in actual grounded out in kind of the protections that can really help, especially the things that you want to move to the top of your list. But this whole idea of controlling the use of administrative privileges, there's some good advice there for some low-hanging fruit types of things. They do a nice job in adding specifics to what you can do there and how you can achieve those. And we'll cover some of that as well. So what's the other, let me take a second and the reality is, there's a lot of risk management, reducing a data breach or reducing the effect of, somebody taking down a network, because the motivation of these actors are different. Some people are trying to steal things, some people are trying to disrupt networks, et cetera. So the different, threat actors, will go after things for, lots of different reasons. And so clearly securing your environment, securing your network ends up being a really important part, but we also have to justify those expenditures, and sometimes that's a little bit hard to do with security, all by itself. And so this has been this whole idea of controlling administrative and privileged access has been a fairly active area for the regulators. So the things there in red under regulatory scrutiny increasing, FISMA, PCI, NERC, et cetera, are stuff that have, standards that have been updated, fairly recently, and sometimes very recently, that include specific new recommendations for controlling privilege or administrative access. For example, with FISMA, which is the law of the land for government organizations here in the United States, NIST has created an updated version of their 853 control set, and these are control sets that are mandated, by the FISMA regulations, and and NIST actually puts the control sets in place, and they split them out into high, medium, and low. But in the latest revision, which is revision 4 of the 853 document, there are over 70 new controls that have specific, are are rooted specifically in controlling privilege or administrative access. In fact, the whole reason for the rewrite or the update to the R4 was one part privileged administrative access and one part because of virtualization and cloud computing changing some of the landscape, which we're also going to talk about a little bit. But PCI DSS has some specific recommendations in there, specific control points in there as to the recent versions of the NERC SIP. And even those that, and by the way, there's a host of international regulatory requirements that also answer the call there with privilege and administrative impact. So but a key point here is that even in cases where they haven't necessarily been rewritten or updated to specifically call out privileged access, the auditors that are coming in and auditing your environment are very much focused on that, and that almost goes back to the WikiLeaks. That was kind of the first clarion call for insider threats. So they're certainly looking at this with much finer in a much finer grained way, and expecting organizations to be able to prove that they can control this kind of access and in a fairly rigorous and provable way. So the audit piece is a piece of it, the regulatory piece is a piece of it, and certainly a lot of folks that we talk to not only have to meet those regulatory requirements, but also use that as a way to drive the funding of the initiatives that they're going to have to implement internally to get it done. So before we go a whole lot further, wanted to kind of, this idea of, just who are privileged users, can sometimes be a little nebulous. So we wanted to put a really specific fine point on this, and, kind of start with kind of a fairly traditional network, in today's, environment. And you'll notice that it is, one part traditional infrastructure, one part, cloud, public cloud infrastructure, et cetera. But you've got, who is a privileged user when we refer to it, typically talk to the folks of the systems, network, database, or even applications administrative groups, and that's a pretty good list of who folks are. There's some arguments to be made, and I think we get this question all the time. Aren't, for example, certain business users, somebody with signature authority in a bank, for example, aren't those privileged users as well? And absolutely can be considered a privileged user. The folks that we're talking about tend to have the kind of the keys to the kingdom, not just the keys within inside a specific application. But as we've gone along here and things have changed to our environments, the infrastructure and the applications that we've implemented, there's a couple of new things to point out. One is this idea of the administrative console. And there have always been network and systems administration tools in environments, but some of these new console accounts are particularly powerful. They tie into the idea of a software-defined network or a software-defined data center, where through typically a web-based interface, an administrator can go in and reconfigure the networking, reconfigure or stand up new virtual machines or new instances in a public cloud environment, for example. They can delete, add, change, copy, move things around, make new network paths, open up ports, etc., all from a single console. So these console accounts become really the Uber super user account in the new environment, and that includes whether you're talking infrastructure or for example, Microsoft Office 365 and Exchange administration, etc. So these kinds of console accounts have cropped up in lots of different areas. The other point we make on the slide is some of our administrators work on premise and some of them work off premise. I mean, they may be a contractor working from their own office. It may be an employee working from a coffee shop. So no longer are we protected by a lot of the perimeter controls that we're used to in this environment. So the perimeter is really dissolved. In fact, there's a pretty good argument to be made that identity ends up becoming the new perimeter. Do you know who is trying to get to your resources, and then can you make the appropriate policy decisions about where they can access from and what they can do once they get there, versus the firewall being in days of old being kind of the perimeter and those kind of controls. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that's gone over time. I want to introduce another concept here of somebody that actually doesn't have hands, fingers, or even a head, but it is also a privileged piece of the infrastructure. There are lots of applications within organizations that have, for example, passwords and other credentials, stuffed directly into the source code of the application. That source code, very often, it's either directly in the source code. Sometimes they're in config files, etc. But often those aren't very well protected. So those, that may be a password to a database. A fairly common story that we see in environments is where you might have a password. You might have a holding company, for example, that has to roll up financials every month or every quarter, and an application that would go out and pull from the different holding company, the sub databases, and so there may be a password for each of those databases. Some Oracle passwords, some Microsoft SQL Server passwords, etc., right in the application. And so those are things that you clearly want to be able to protect as well. They aren't privileged users per se, but they're certainly a privileged piece of the infrastructure. And having those passwords stuffed in the applications makes it difficult, on two reasons. It becomes really, really difficult, for example, to change the database application passwords if you end up breaking a lot of applications. So it's hard. It's much more difficult to coordinate that. It's time consuming, etc. And then, of course, if those passwords are in the applications themselves, then there are a lot of folks who might have access to the source control systems that might have access to those passwords, and therefore that infrastructure that you don't want to have access to. So it's much more difficult to control. I want to add a couple of other folks to this concept of who are privileged users. First is this idea of an unauthorized user, and that takes a couple of shapes and forms. One is somebody who may, for example, have worked on a project for some time, been given some privileges, as they were a part of a project team, and then when they left the project team, or perhaps even left the company, those privileges weren't taken away. We are pretty good at a lot of organizations of giving privileges away. We're not so good at taking them away in a timely manner when somebody changes teams or whether they no longer need those. Yes, a lot of organizations try to audit those over time, and some of the governance tools have come into play to at least provide lists of who should be authorized, or a list who are authorized within an organization, and then getting the business users or the technical management team involved in deciding whether they should still be authorized. But that's still, the provisioning is something we have solved pretty well. The deprovisioning is something that we haven't necessarily solved very well. And then certainly there's the idea of the hacker, whether that person is an internal agent working for somebody, or is just somebody trying to come through the external, coming through the internet to get at us. Very often, they're using lots of sophisticated, multi-dimensional attack vectors. So they may be using spear phishing to put a malware payload on some systems, and then use that to pilfer off, account passwords, etc. With the idea of, things like LinkedIn and other social media, it's not really hard to find who the privileged users are at any particular organization, figure out who they are, and then craft a targeted spear phishing attack that can be pretty lethal. So you'd argue pretty hard that if you're going to go after some passwords, getting an end user password is interesting. Getting a privileged password to a database or to the security infrastructure is much more interesting than that. So I think that kind of gives us a much more big picture of what this threat actually looks like in totality, kind of in a total sense. So there's some specific issues that kind of crop up out of that really have led to why you need privileged identity tools, or what some of these things have been fashioned to try to solve, and I call them the big A issues. So the first one is access control, and it's really being able to provide fine-grained access control. And an associated issue there is this idea of shared passwords. So there's two things to solve for there: being able to implement a set of fine-grained access controls, who can actually get to what resources. But the other thing is being able to control shared passwords. Very often administrators have spreadsheets or documents or a shared drive where the passwords to all the different systems are kept, maintained, and then sent around to everybody. And that's certainly no way to protect the proverbial keys to the kingdom. Now, there's been a lot of discussion. I ran into this a lot at the Cloud Identity Summit. In I guess Mark Twain, kind of saying, the death of passwords has been greatly exaggerated. All of us are running hybrid environments, so even this isn't what we'd like to have happen. Certainly a lot of folks would like to get rid of passwords, but the reality is that they're going to be here, for a while. And in fact, we not only have now passwords, but we've also got credentials or other, keys that we have to use. And to the extent, that administrators, are using a key to get access. If they're sharing that key, you wind up with some of the same issues. A shared password doesn't provide the kind of auditability that you want. It doesn't provide the kind of access control that you want. So, we may, end up exchanging one problem, passwords, to another with some of the keys. So that's one of the issues. The other issue is that a lot of the way that, a lot of the ways that controls around privileged users have typically worked is once you are authenticated, you ended up having, de facto authorization to do a lot. It wasn't fine-grained control over what people could do. It was kind of blunt force, and I'll talk about that a little bit in more specific on the next slide. Another issue is just attribution. So if we're sharing passwords, it's obviously very hard to understand, who was doing, what on any particular resource. So who was root on the database server at, 2 o'clock on Tuesday is a very difficult question to ask if you're using shared passwords. It's also a difficult question to ask if every system on the network is set up with a shared account, which is the norm. And it's the norm because it's the easiest thing to set up. It's the easiest way to configure your environment, and that hasn't changed a lot in the past, and it is not likely to change when you get into virtualization and cloud computing, which is a much more dynamic environment. So setting up individual administrative accounts on each piece of infrastructure in your environment becomes a huge overhead. So many organizations use shared accounts, but in that same breath, auditors want to know that you can say, for your own protection, forget the auditors for a moment, you'd like to be able to know who was doing what on a particular, with a particular account, and certainly this is the kind of audit scrutiny that we're seeing. And that leads us to the next point here. It's just auditability. It's not just who got to what, who was root on the database server at Tuesday. If you can answer that question, great. But the bigger question ends up being, what exactly did they do? Can you reconstruct that? And there are a lot of log file, tools. SIMS plays a role here, but trying to figure out, it tends to be a very incomplete role. Trying to figure out exactly what was done by reassembling audit logs, from the systems and database servers, it ends up being a tricky business, and albeit imperfect. So, being able to attribute who and exactly what they do are two pieces, and this is one of the big issues. Having auditability down at the level that you can, with a greater degree of certainty, know exactly what went on with that particular session ends up being important. So this is the backdrop, if you will, the kinds of problems that the privileged identity management vendors have really been trying to solve. And so let's look at that for a little bit and see how that kind of played out. And this is a little bit of in the beginning. Really the first step that a lot of clients that we've talked to over the past, almost decade of being in here, in being involved in this market, here's the kinds of things that we ran into, the do-it-yourself kinds of things that people tried to do. None of them worked perfectly, but these were all things that different organizations use. So, jump boxes or bastion hosts, a stronghold at the edge of the network out in the DMZ that you could at least, really lock down that server and make sure it was, configured and hardened so it could sit in a place that was maybe susceptible to attack, but harden it against attack. And then, if you got a footprint on there, you could use these, set of tools and administrative services to, jump into different parts of the network. The problem is, very often is once you were in, you were in. It was a fairly blunt force object, not unlike an SSL VPN. Great, that solves the problem of somebody being at Starbucks and a man-in-the-middle attack, for example. But once I'm on the network, it takes away some of those man-in-the-middle attacks. But once I'm on the network I typically, as an administrator, I typically had full range to go to where I want. So it was not a, it was a, I land you on the network, I got you to the internal network securely. I didn't necessarily then control where you went beyond that. Network access control is something that often came up, as part of the solution, and to some extent, that would make sure that if I'm bringing a device onto the network and going to give it an actual footprint on the network, I could assure that it was at least configured and up to stuff. It was patched and it had virus protections and virus signatures and malware signatures were up to date, so that I wasn't bringing something from outside the network onto the network that was likely to leave some malware there, drop it off. But again, that fairly blunt force, good control to have in place, but by itself didn't solve some of the issues, the big A issues that we just talked about. Firewall rules and router ACLs, doing some level of network segmentation was something that logical network segmentation, which was something that people tried a lot. They had some success, but most organizations, like to set up a relatively flat network. We see in the retail industry a lot of folks try to cordon off either logically or physically the part of their network that has the PCI, the credit card data, so that they can protect that piece with some specific controls, and then the audit then is limited to just that segment of the network and not a whole flat network. But again, these are difficult controls to put in place, and they tend to be brittle. The more the larger and more spread out your network is, you end up either having holes or you've got it locked down so tight people can't get to where they need to go. But the thing that crops up all the time is sometimes with trying to use a firewall or router, to do the job of a different tool, ends up making those tools, the rule sets in them, more brittle or making them perform poorly. So you're playing, even the ways that you could do some logical segmentation, it wasn't ideal because you ended up really kind of making a whole lot more rules than or ACLs than you'd really like to do. They made the particular function perform poorly on a router or firewall. And then certainly there was physical segmentation. We've had some clients that have done that. Fairly expensive proposition and worthwhile. But again, if I can get to a specific network segment, just like getting to the flat network, beyond that there wasn't a whole lot of fine-grained access control. What I got access to or what I could do once I was there, which are two of the things that you really had to worry about with a privileged user and that particular threat. So what we started to have, there was a problem, and I'm just going to bring a couple of these up and we'll start with. So, the privileged identity management market shaped up in a couple of different ways. There was some point products in a couple of different areas. So third-party access control, fine-grained access control, and tools that were specifically focused on third-party access control was one segment. In fact, that's a segment that Xceedium started in. This was when we first started when the business first started. This was the particular use case that we were optimized for. A outsourcer or third-party vendor that had to get into and manage a particular resource in the network, and you wanted to do that with fine-grained access controls and maybe session management, session monitoring, and recording, which is where we started. But password vaulting systems were also a component there. Being able to solve that part of the problem with shared passwords and being able to put those in a vault, for example, lock them down and only provide those passwords out to people who had a need to know them, was an important piece of the privileged identity management market. And then logging and recording systems, systems that did much more fine-grained logging or even full session recording. So that was certainly these three segments kind of started out largely on their own. And a fourth segment was really identity bridging, when we had multiple different networks, especially as cloud and virtualization cropped up. Many organizations had identities stored. They had finally gotten to the place where they had stored in one or just a couple locations, maybe Active Directory and an LDAP environment. And so being able to have some sort of one place for identity and policy and roles to be defined, and then being able to leverage that into other environments ended up being an important part of the puzzle. So identity bridges clearly played a role. But the problem was these were all kind of point products. And about 2011, these things started to really come together into a full suite of tools where a couple of vendors were providing kind of the whole kit. And this is the migration path that the Xceedium team took. We started in third-party access control. We bought and added had recording capability added to the product, and then made an acquisition back in 2011, where we bought a password management system as well, and integrated that technology. So really, the modern PIM product, starting in around 2011, was a set of integrated controls, in a single platform, rather than a bunch of point products that came together. So that brings us to what's next, and what's driving the marketplace need for a next generation kind of product. That got us pretty far down the path. It answered many of those big A questions, did that kind of nicely, solved a lot of those things with a purpose-built tool that you could use in an environment. These things they didn't tend to be really hard to implement. I always say that, the marketing guy, whenever he says that, you want to throttle him. But having grown up most of my career in the other side of the tracks, both with a research firm and at a large insurance company, I've been on the other side. But when I say, they're relatively easy to implement, you can get a tool, a modern PIM tool, up and running in a matter of weeks to a few short months. It's not a multi-year kind of effort that a lot of the identity and access management market, the larger identity access management market kinds of tools are. And that's a fairly simple reason. There are fewer users. You've got lots of infrastructure, lots of different nodes that you're trying to lock down and protect, for example, but the ratio of the number of people to the number of nodes is a smaller thing. So you can make a lot of progress in this environment with the modern PIM tool. But that's not enough now. We've got a new environment, and clearly, many organizations are already running a hybrid environment, and by that hybrid, we stole a slide from the Gartner folks, kind of identifying the different stages that people go through, from a traditional environment through server virtualization all the way up into public cloud. I've always had trouble with this chart because it shows hybrid cloud as kind of stage 4. That almost seems like a different stage to me. But the idea is that most of us aren't throwing away a lot of our old infrastructure. The enterprise customers that we work with are absolutely telling us they've still got their mainframes, they still got their bare metal Linux and Unix installed. They certainly migrated a lot of that environment to a virtualized infrastructure on-prem, so a virtualized private cloud environment, either on-prem or in a third-party data center that they're renting space from, for example. But obviously, a lot of organizations are going very quickly, frankly, faster even than we thought to, going to the cloud with both infrastructure as a service kinds of implementations, platform as a service, and certainly software as a service type of implications. And that has some specific connotations. The business drivers have the one that always gets thrown up there is cost, but we're seeing, and a lot of our customers are telling us, that the next 3 are as or more important. Speed and agility, to be able to time to market, be able to get new kinds of applications up and running very quickly. Sometimes just being able to test new kinds of applications, whether that's a new, very highly mobile distributed application, or, for example, being able to do some big data analytics application without having to make multi-million-dollar investments up front, but being able to get a test up there, prove out the theory, get that running. And so we're seeing that across all the sectors, across manufacturing and healthcare and pharma, et cetera, retail, kinds of environments where they're doing really exciting new things in the cloud. They aren't, organizations aren't necessarily jettisoning their existing applications, this existing operations applications. They're moving them in a big way to virtualized on-premise infrastructure. And some folks are moving those, clear up to infrastructure as a service kinds of environments. That brings in this whole new idea of the idea of a software-defined infrastructure. And this is where we start talking about these consoles where the infrastructure is no more I'm plugging in boxes in my data center, but I'm firing up new virtual machines in my data center or new instances in a cloud environment or turning on new SaaS capabilities. So it's a wholly different IT operations model that we're running into, and it brings up really new and interesting risk and compliance issues. So thought we'd share a couple of that. So as you move through these stages, we're certainly seeing that there's new risks, security and compliance risks that people are dealing with. The first of those is that you end up having really an extended management plane. So we always had root accounts. We always had, whether it was our servers and admin accounts on our databases or privilege accounts on our network and security devices. We had those, but now we've got these new console accounts that we have to think about locking down and managing. So that's a much larger surface area, and some of that surface area overhangs our traditional perimeter controls. No longer can we be thinking that we'll just operate this in the four walls of our data center. That's all locked down. We're doing it from inside the network. These are web-based web-based applications that you can get access to from anywhere if you're not locking them down. In many cases, it's a shared security and audit model. If you Gartner guys have a very good slide that takes you from infrastructure as a service through platform as a service and up to software as a service. And it's a simple slide that shows, much like this slide from bottom left to top right. The further you get into software as a service, the vendor is taking care of more of the security requirements. The further down you are towards infrastructure as a service, you are sharing that responsibility with the vendor. They are locking down their environment, they're locking down the privilege side of it, but they're taking care of the environment really from the physical presence, from the cement through the hypervisor, as it's been said. But infrastructure that you put up on their environment up above the hypervisor, you've got to bring a control set to. You're always responsible for the whole thing from an audit and compliance perspective, but you end up having to bring marrying up a set of security controls with the controls that the vendor already has in place to make a full complement of security controls. It's not and some of these vendors have done a fantastic job locking down their environment and done a whole lot of work providing audit scrutiny. We have had a chance to talk a lot with the Amazon Web Services folks, and they've gone through huge amount of first of all, they've implemented an impressive set of controls in their environment, for example, but they've also gone through a huge amount of audit scrutiny, and very recently been they were certified by the federal government, in their the Fed guys are doing a cloud first initiative, and there's a whole certification process that cloud providers have to go through to be certified, to work, so that the government organizations can use them. And so they've gone through these exams. A lot of the cloud providers, not many of them have gone through the federal process, only a select handful, but a lot of these cloud providers and software as a service providers are going through various different audits. One interesting thing that people run into kind of sometimes late in the game is that these new consoles are almost like bringing a typical systems management model together with iTunes. They are not just a setup administrative model. In many cases, you're adding new servers, adding new storage, etc., and that's charging the corporate credit card. So thinking through, you used to, if you were doing it in traditional old bare metal install, you were procuring servers, you were procuring operating systems and software that would run on that, and that went through a procurement process. Now you can kind of fire these things up, with a couple of clicks in an environment, or add new users to a SaaS-based application. So there's this idea of marrying up administration with procurement that is kind of closely knit now, and so folks are trying to work through those issues. Certainly, federated identity ends up being not a big issue, but something that you just need to solve. We've done a lot of work at a lot of enterprises with finally consolidating the reference, into a single or at least a few databases. Who are the users, whether they're customers, partners, etc., and what kind of roles do they play with the organization? What groups are they involved in? So, not having to recreate that, that identity store, or removing the islands of identity problem ends up being a key goal as well. And the last one I'll leave you with is this idea of this highly dynamic and elastic environment that the further you get into the public cloud, environment, the more that plays a role. And that has some very specific architectural requirements that you need to pay attention to that we'll talk to here in just a second. Ran across this fairly interestingly. This is a really interesting document. If you Google NIST Special Publication 500-299, they've got a new cloud computing and security reference architecture. It's in draft format, but I think very illustrative of the role that privilege plays in this. This is an absolute eye chart. I won't take you through all of this, but I will direct your attention to this whole block of privilege management infrastructure. So there's a whole security set of things on the right side of this chart, security and risk management set of things that need to get done. Traditional things like data protection, policies and standards, threat and vulnerability management. And NIST thought so highly of the idea of managing and monitoring administrative users that they've made this a block all unto itself about what you need to do to manage these administrative cases, and this is just a blow up of that particular piece of the overall architecture. And interestingly, on the right in the document, and this is mapped out in this 500-299 document, they map that against the 853 controls. So the 53 controls are broken down into different kinds of control sets, and they're color coded in terms of what kind, whether it's a program management thing or identification, authentication. But you'll notice in here that identity management is spec'd out, and federation is specifically spec'd out. Authorization is separated. Authentication is separated from authorization, and then privilege uses management, vaulting passwords, or session logging. These are all parts of the things that they think you're going to need to have a comprehensive program in place for privileged users. So this was really illustrative, probably worth looking into. It'll certainly go through some tune-ups before it comes out beyond draft in its final form, but some really good insights into what you need to do. So that leaves us with what are the key requirements that you need to be asking of your privilege identity management vendor. And we've covered a lot of these, but let me kind of wrap a little bit of a bow around this, and I'll cover a couple more in some depth. So the really table stakes is this first one. You can't, most enterprises can't afford to have lots of different point products, something doing password management, the other thing doing fine-grained access control, another thing doing session monitoring or session recording, another thing doing identity bridge. It's just too operationally complex, on one hand, but almost as importantly, it also becomes, you've got two things. You've got to implement these controls and manage them over the time, which has an operational impact if it's not integrated. But the other thing is it becomes particularly difficult to prove to the auditors that you're actually doing what you need to do. So when they come in, if you've got to go to 3 or 4 or 5 different products, to prove that you've implemented the appropriate set of controls for the appropriate infrastructure, that just becomes a whole lot of wasted motion, if you can't get it or show it in an integrated tool. So that's one aspect, and it's really table stakes for this environment. We're going back to 2011, these things kind of came together. So if you're not at that point, if you don't have a comprehensive integrated control set, and I would add to that statement, under a single policy management regime, so that you can, you're not having to jump all over the place to implement policies. That's particularly important. The second aspect of this is you've got to be able to protect infrastructure and applications wherever they live. If you're not already decidedly hybrid as an enterprise, you're likely going to be going there over time. So a tool that only protects traditional infrastructure running in a data center, or does a little bit of cloud washing and maybe can protect instances running up in on a virtualized environment, for example, maybe servers running on the VMware environment you can protect, but they can't lock down the VM console, for example, or instances that may run up in AWS environment, but you can't lock down, the console. If you can't take care of all of those things in one platform, then again you'll be driving point. You'll either leave yourself exposed, or you'll be adding another point tool to deal with that piece, and it just becomes particularly difficult from an operational and an audit perspective. The last one here is really easy to say, and much more difficult to underpin with some points. And I'll make a case for it now, this architected specifically for the highly dynamic cloud environment, and then I would absolutely encourage you to join us on the 23rd, where we're going to show you some specific examples of how this plays. In an environment, let me go all the way out to, for example, infrastructure as a service. In an environment where a systems administrator, with a couple of clicks of a console, for example, can spin up tens, 50s, hundreds new servers that needed to be managed, you've got to figure out how to deal with that. And we talked about the business driver there, right, is speed and agility. If, as the security team, your privilege identity management answer to that is, okay, we love the fact that you've spun up all those new servers, give us a couple of days and we'll configure the policies for them, it's not going to be popular. Let's just say it that way. So being able to, for example, auto-discover all those devices, what came up in the environment or what went away in the environment, it's actually less than half the battle, but particularly important. The nice thing about virtualized infrastructure, whether it's run in your data center, VMware environments, for example, or even cloud environments, is you can get, as a security team, nearly perfect optics into what's out there. Really, hard for somebody to plug in something in a cloud provider's environment, because they don't actually have physical access. They have to go through the console, to send something up, or to implement something new. So we can't get a new server under the desk, for example, or a wireless access point in a particularly inopportune place. So it helps some of those things, but this idea, I can spin up so many things. If I can spin up 100 new devices and it's going to take me days to figure out those devices, that shouldn't be hard. Auto discovery is there. But if now it's going to take me days to go fingers to keyboard to provision those devices with the appropriate security policies, we're in trouble. So and as we've gone heavily into this cloud environment, that's something that we had to solve, and so you've got to not only be able to, one example of this architected specifically for the dynamic cloud is being able to auto-discover and auto-provision devices. If 100 new devices show up on the network, I've got to be able to automatically tie a certain set of policies to those devices, be able to pull the credentials out of those devices right away so that they're protected, within the first couple of seconds of them going live, not a couple of days later, and and not getting in the way of the speed and agility that the businesses want, and one of the reasons that they're moving to the cloud in the first place. I'm going to run kind of quickly through how this might look like. When we talk about this in a theory way, it doesn't always come. It leaves you with a hard way to get a mind's eye picture of how this might work into practice. So we've got a systems administrator who needs to do some work on a file system. This file system could be a bare metal install. It could be sitting on a virtualized platform or in the cloud. It wouldn't matter. This use case would be the same in our context. So they're going to need to do some maintenance on that particular box, so they need privilege access to it to do that work. Well, the first thing that we would have wanted to do here is make sure that we put these passwords or other credentials under management. So we don't want easy to guess passwords. We want hard, difficult passwords, or if it's credentials. Either way, we want to put those things in a vault, and frankly, not necessarily have to give that end user access to them. We don't necessarily want those credentials or those passwords to have to get out to their laptop, or any other mobile device that they're using to access this thing. If we do, then they're at risk from malware and other things. So put them under management, put them in a vault, and don't make them use those. Then the idea is to use strong authentication techniques. There's a lot of multi-factor authentication, smart cards, etc., that we support to make sure that we can positively authenticate this user into our gateway or our proxy device. Then we want to separating authentication from authorization, control access. What devices, now that we've authenticated, we know exactly who they are, what devices can they actually have access to? That's a piece of this puzzle. The second piece of this puzzle is let's monitor them and make sure that they not only have access to a particular device, but we can control what they do once they're there. Maybe they can do a bunch of file system management, but they can't reboot the server, for example. So if we don't want them to have access to the reboot command, we don't put that in the whitelist, or we'll blacklist it, for example, so that they can't run unauthorized commands. So that's the second bastion. The other thing is for auditability, let's record the whole session. Let's know exactly what they did. And, again, all these controls, are pointing at least privilege and layering these controls. You don't have to use every one in every circumstance. You can use one, you can use the set of controls that you need, based on, whether this is a really important file server, for example. The next piece is, just because they've got a presence on the network on one device, we don't want to give them now access to the, let them go laterally to other devices. They should only get access to the things that they have been explicitly granted access to. They shouldn't be able to SSH over to another box or RDP hop, for example. And lastly, even if you're using a shared administrative account, a root account on this box, the fact that we've done these other things in the past, we still know this. For example, this is Tim, and on Tuesday at 2 o'clock, he had access to this particular file server, and we know exactly what he did once he was there, even with him using a root account. So that's how some of those things may play out in a traditional environment. And that's exactly, I told you I wouldn't spend a lot of time talking about Xceedium here. We'll do some real deep dive demos over the next couple of presentations that we do on the 23rd and the 30th, but wanted to give you an idea about what the platform was. So our Xceedium platform controls and audits all privilege access, regardless of where stuff lives. And we've got highlighted there the Office 365 environment. That's because it's the newest addition to our portfolio. So we've been doing Amazon for a couple of years. We did VMware earlier this year, and we've added the Office 365 environment as well. So we control all the privilege access to that environment as well. And you look at the set of controls that we enforce across these environments. These are controls that you can turn on or things that you can use depending on the risk of the particular piece of infrastructure, the application. The idea, though, is you can implement, either less or more rigorous least privilege access to these things and control it all under one unified policy management regime. The other thing that I would add to the requirements for a next-gen privilege identity management platform is you ought to, as a customer, be able to run this wherever you need to. So we've got multiple form factors. If you want to run it as a hardware appliance in your data center, you can do that. If you'd like to run it as a virtual appliance, either in your data center or up in the public cloud, you can do that. And we want to make it clear that it doesn't matter which of those appliance form factors you choose. You can manage across this whole environment with any of them. So, for example, with running Xsuite as an AMI up in the AWS environment, you can obviously control the AWS environment, but you control all the way back to your mainframe, Unix networking devices as well. You have to have a network path, of course, to those from your public cloud environment back to the traditional data center. But once that's set up, we can control those as well. So that gives you, some idea of what a, next-gen privilege identity management application would look like at the highest level. There's a bunch of core capabilities that these products have to have that we've kind of highlighted here. In addition to sending the recording, we're also going to send through a white paper for you on what, in a much more elaborate way, what are the next-gen requirements, and a two-pager that lists, specifically call out, those requirements. So folks that are, looking at doing a procurement now or in the near term, can look at those set of requirements, add the ones that make sense to them in their environment into their procurement scenarios. So what do we think kind of sets us apart? Well, we think we truly are the only next-gen, privilege identity management platform that kind of covers all the things that we talked about with a comprehensive set of controls enforced under one policy, regime, and it's a single policy enforcement point across a whole hybrid cloud, whether that's virtualized, infrastructure as a service, or even software as a service. We've protected both the management consoles and the guest system, so we didn't leave out any of the critical components. We've done, and we'll show over the next couple of sessions that we'll do and webinars will show you much deeper level of integration into some of these environments. So we're not doing a cloud washing version of this. We've really spent significant time with each of these vendors with tight partnerships and using the APIs and using the infrastructure that they've built in their environments to make this thing happen, work well, and integrate nicely. We've always, had very high performance platform. We've traditionally sold to the, Fortune 500, Global 2000 size organizations. So performance, reliability, and scalability has always been a key component of what we've done. We've always architected specifically for that, and we've been put through the paces since we do have, some, portion of our market. It's not the largest portion of our market, but a very, substantial portion of our market in U.S. federal government. We've had to go through a lot of scrutiny there, and certainly a lot of scrutiny within some of the other vertical environments that we sell to. So, we've got some certifications that frankly no other vendor in this space has. So, with that, we'll answer some questions here, and if you've got any, I know we're kind of right at a little past the top of the hour. But I know there's quite a few folks on, and we appreciate you staying with us here. We've got a couple of questions coming in. So one question, I guess, is a clarification question from that last slide. The first one was, can you run with the virtualized appliance that runs on VMware? Can you control Amazon Web Services environment? Yeah, the answer is absolutely yes. We can do that from any one of those form factors, whether it's a hardware appliance or either of the flavors of the virtual appliance that we run. We can cover that. So that was a fairly easy one. Any other questions that we want to hit here? Certainly we'll be available. You can always hit us up on the website at Xceedium.com. There is a contact us form. You can always shoot follow-up questions as you get into this. And as I said, we'll send out a copy of not only the recording, but we'll also send out. In fact, that's just, the next question we got. There's a presentation which can be shared over email. We'll send the recording of this. Let me see if I can actually package up the presentation as well. We'll send a white paper and a 2-pager with some of these next generation requirements called out specifically as well. A couple more questions coming in. Oh, this is a very good question, kind of an interesting thing here. So is Xsuite strictly to monitor privileged user or all users in a cloud, for example, a SharePoint environment? So let me give you the specific technical answer to that, or let me give you the first answer. I'll give you the technical answer. So the first answer is as a company, we've been absolutely focused on the privileged users for a lot of the reasons that we talked about today. That's a crop of users that you want to have a lot more scrutiny on. In fact, the ones that our customers have wanted to record and monitor specifically. That said, within this SharePoint environment, yes, we can actually monitor all users in that environment. That's not the use case that we were designed for, but in solving the technical challenges to be able to not only provide single sign-on and do the granular access control and restrict access into the SharePoint administrative console, we can also record those sessions. Those include regular SharePoint sessions as well. But again, that's something we want to discuss in a lot more detail with you to see if that's the right exact use case for the product. So see if I'll stay on for just a little while longer and see if we have any other questions come up. There's a good crop of them so far. Well, it looks like we've got most of them handled. If anybody has any in there that I'm missing here, we'll get back to you directly on email and answer any other specifics. You'll certainly reach out to us on email if you hit the info at Xceedium.com or hit our contact us page. We would happily answer any questions. Oh, I got one more here. This is actually a good one. I'm not sure if I understand this one in all its. So what? Let me hit the email. It's about encryption and is encryption built in. Let me hit that in a couple of different ways. So the recordings that we do are not encrypted, but they're hashed so that they're tamper resistant. We know if one of the log files or one of our recordings is actually messed with, and that ends up letting us scale that unbelievably well in that environment. But we do encrypt a lot of other stuff. So we've got our password vault where we're vaulting the either passwords or the credentials. We can vault credentials and keys as well and manage those. And those are encrypted, and we get very high levels of encryption too. We've got some strategic partnerships with folks that do HSMs. So in our hardware appliance, you can add an HSM a card into the appliance, or in any of our appliances, the hardware appliance and the virtual appliance, if you're already using an HSM offboard, particularly with some partnerships that we've done with our friends over at SafeNet, we can manage the keys, for SSL sessions or the other, we manage all those keys through an offboard HSM. It gives you some really high levels of control over that. So there's lots that we can do with an encryption, both in managing keys in our environment and beyond that. There's a specific question here. I'll get back to the questioner that I want to make sure that I get exactly the right answer to, that I don't want to take a flyer at. So Sanjay, thanks for asking that question. We'll get back to you specifically on that. All right, well, with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Fantastic to have you along. Keep an eye out for the part 2 and part 3. In part 2, we're going to take you through a deep dive and show you some demonstration of next-gen features in action. And in part 3, we've got some really, really cool new functionality that we're rolling out in the public cloud environment that will talk to the some additional kind of controls for administration. And I'm not gonna trip over and pre-announce something yet, but what I can tell you, it's some really exciting new functionality that we've gotten lots of customer requests for, and has gotten really good play from not only the folks, the analysts in the industry that we've briefed, but some key customers that we've already briefed now. So we're really excited to take you through that one. Those are on the 23rd and the 30th of this month, so stay tuned for that. We'll get invites out for that. And with that, we're going to wrap up today. Thank you for joining, and look forward to hearing you or seeing and talking with you on the next session. Bye now.